Hello, everybody. You're watching Liquid Lunch on Biz TV. John Tabacco has a well-deserved day off on a golf course somewhere, and I have the very, very lucky pleasure of being able to, or distinct pleasure, of being able to talk about all the news of the day with a woman who started out as the bail bond queen of New York, and then her empire expanded. She became the bail bond queen of New York and New Jersey. Now there's pretty much universal recognition that she is the nation's bail bond queen, the one and only Michelle Esquenazi, the CEO of Empire Bail Bonds. Michelle, it is good to see you. How have you been?
Great. How about you, Frankie? I've seen that you've been taking some time for yourself.
Yeah, I have I've been putting on the extra weight at different restaurants to prove it. Trust me. All right,
Good.
Michelle, I want to ask you about what we're seeing in terms of the aftermath of the Breonna Taylor decision. You see the front page of today's New York Post. You had one police officer indicted rather than the three police officers, as some would have preferred. Rage in Louisville. And in Louisiana, in a separate state, two police officers actually shot yesterday in some protests amidst the Breonna Taylor decision. Give me your take in terms of what we're seeing on these riots and these demonstrations that have erupted in the aftermath of this grand jury decision.
Well, I mean, the first thing that I would say is that as it pertains to Breonna Taylor, I mean, we certainly pray for her family. But that was just a situation that went awry, Frankie. And unfortunately, it ends up defining blue. And then it just becomes this furtherance towards, this kind of hate for everything blue. And I think the hate for everything in all things, whether it's hate for all Hispanic people or Muslim people or police, I think is abhorrent. So I think it's just too piled up into one. And I think that that's inappropriate. And as it pertains to that officer's bail and release, there are people that are getting released every day for having sex with children. That might be a bit more abhorrent.
Well, and here in New York, we saw the situation last weekend where the A train actually derailed because someone actually threw an object, a saboteur threw an object which caused it to derail. Turns out, shockingly, that person had been released without bail for a very similar crime. So go figure, a lot of these folks, when you let them right out of jail without any sort of bail or without any sort of penalty, many of them end up doing the same thing. I'm curious, Michelle, what impact, because we've now seen some version of bail reform in New Jersey. We've seen a major version of bail reform in New York. This is something more and more cities are talking about implementing. What have we seen in terms of the actual impact on crime, especially violent crime, in states and cities that have implemented bail reform?
Oh, you've seen a tremendous uptick, but the reason is the reason. And the reason is so ugly, Frankie, that no one talks about it. And it's pretty crazy to me, because what happens when you have a recidivist community of offenders, right? And out of that 100%, 75% of them are mentally ill and also addicted to narcotics. And they're not incarcerated. So therefore, they're not being given methadone, or they're not being given their pills every certain amount of hours, and they're not being attended to. And you're just letting them out into the streets. Not only do they have no homes, they have no medications, and they also will do anything to get their drugs. So that's what you're really seeing. So it's a public safety crisis nightmare.
Well, one of the things that we heard during the whole debate about bail reform is that the people that have been pushing so much for onerous bail restrictions have been people like you, the bail bonds union, the bail bond industry, and the corrections officers union, because they want to do right by their members, or in your case, you want to do right by yourself. What do you say in response to that? Is part of the reason that you're so adamant about opposing efforts to bail reform is because it affects your own pocketbook?
No, because I mean, the gravedigger gets paid, the coroner gets paid, the sanitation guys get paid. Me and corrections are the coal miners of criminal justice. I mean, we really don't have fancy jobs. We have the crappiest jobs, to be honest with you. We don't get paid a ton of money. The reason that we're the ones speaking the loudest is because we know better. That's the God's honest reason. We know better than you.com.
I hope somebody's registering that domain. Michelle, in terms of, I don't think there's anybody that wants people in jail just because they're poor. Here in New York, the example that always gets pointed to is Khalif Browder, who was in Rikers for stealing a backpack, never convicted, but he didn't have the money for bail, had a very poor relationship with some of the correction officers there, and then ultimately ended up killing himself. But then you look at where New York went, in which they've taken away any discretion at all from judges, and which judges are not even allowed to evaluate whether someone's a public health risk. And most reasonable people, Democrat or Republican, think that, okay, that goes a little too far. In your view, is there a way to go about bail reform responsibly while not allowing this zoo that we've seen here in New York?
100%. It just really pertains to a system of checks and balances. So if you are classified, let's say, for example, as a recidivist because you're a continual bank robber and a home burglary person, then you should be subject to mandatory secured bail. If you're a person that after 72 hours has been deemed to be either an addict or you're mentally ill, then you need to be medicated and quite possibly civilly committed even to jail.
Okay. And fair enough. In terms of the presidential election, obviously, I know you're for Trump, but I'm curious, objectively, putting on your objective analyst cap in the last 10 seconds that we have here, do you think the chaos that we're seeing on the streets has a net effect helping Trump or hurting him?
I think it absolutely helps him. Trump's the law and order president.com.
Yet another domain name registered. Michelle, always a treat talking to you. Thank you.
You too, Frankie.
All right. In just a moment, we're going to chat with a woman who's written a book about President Trump, which is not a favorable one from what I gather. And a little bit later, those of you that are looking to make some money this weekend, our resident sportsmeister, Nico Romano, will give you his picks for those of you that are betting on football this weekend for what's going to happen in each of the games that you're going to see this weekend, beginning with a very interesting game this evening. So we'll tell you about that, and we'll continue to give you a preview of Tuesday night's presidential debate. If you're just tuning in, you're watching Liquid Lunch on Biz TV. In for John Tabacco, who's on the golf course. He's going to be back tomorrow, and coming up, we'll maybe even read some of your Facebook comments. You're watching Liquid Lunch. I'm Frank Morano.